Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how a well-kept 15 or 20-year-old Toyota or Honda can pull out of a driveway looking and running almost like it just left the showroom? Meanwhile, someone else's 5-year-old car is already burning oil, knocking on cold starts, and leaking from places you'd rather not know about. Same country, same roads, same fuel. So what's actually going on? Most people jump straight to the answer they've heard 100 times. Japanese engineering. And yes, the engineering is excellent. Nobody's arguing that. But here's the thing that almost nobody talks about. The engineering only gets you so far. What really separates a car that goes 300,000 kilometers from one that barely makes it past 100 is something far less glamorous than precision manufacturing. It's habits. Quiet, consistent, almost boring habits that most drivers never develop. And most mechanics never bother explaining. I've spent a lot of time talking to mechanics, reading through fleet maintenance records, and listening to long-term car owners who've kept the same vehicle running for decades. And every single time, the story comes back to the same core idea. The car didn't last because it was lucky or special. It lasted because someone treated it a specific way, consistently from very early on. Today, I want to walk you through exactly what that looks like. Not in a textbook way, but in a real practical way that you can actually use starting with your very next drive. So let's start with something that might genuinely surprise you because it flies in the face of advice people have been giving for generations. You've probably heard someone, a parent, a coworker, an older relative, say that before you drive, especially in the morning or on a cold day, you should let the engine warm up. Just sit there, let it idle for 5, maybe 10 minutes, and only then pull away. It sounds logical. The engine is cold, the oil needs to circulate, the metal needs to expand. Sure, it all makes sense intuitively. But here's what's actually happening inside that engine while you're sitting there waiting. Modern engines, and this applies to pretty much any car built in the last 25 to 30 years, are designed with fuel injection systems and electronic controls that manage the fuel-to-air mixture automatically. When you start a cold engine and let it sit at idle, the fuel delivery is richer than normal because the engine control unit is compensating for cold temperatures. That unburned fuel doesn't just disappear. It washes down the cylinder walls. And when fuel washes the cylinder walls, it strips away the thin film of oil that's supposed to be protecting the metal surfaces. So instead of your warm-up ritual protecting your engine, it's actually stripping lubrication from the most critical moving parts inside it. The pistons are traveling up and down against cylinder walls that are being cleaned of their protective oil film by raw fuel. Do this every day for years, and the wear adds up in ways that don't show up until much later, when it's expensive to fix. Experienced mechanics in Japan, particularly those working on high-mileage fleet vehicles, figured this out a long time ago. The guidance they typically follow is simple. Start the engine. Give it about 30 to 60 seconds. Just enough time for oil pressure to fully establish and for the oil to begin circulating through the top end of the engine, and then drive away gently. Not hard acceleration, not high revs, just smooth, moderate driving for the first 5 to 10 minutes. That's your warm-up. You're using the engine the way it was designed to warm up, under light load, with the cooling and lubrication systems actively doing their job, rather than sitting at idle burning extra fuel and washing your cylinder walls. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You've been doing the long idle warm-up for years, and your car's fine. And maybe it is. But here's the thing about engine wear. It's cumulative, and it's invisible right up until it isn't. The damage from thousands of cold, idle warm-ups doesn't announce itself the next morning. It shows up 3 years later as increased oil consumption, or 5 years later as a compression test that reveals worn rings, or 8 years later as an engine that starts burning a liter of oil every 1,000 kilometers. By that point, most people blame the car or the brand. Very few trace it back to a daily habit they never questioned. This brings me to the next habit, and this one is probably the single most important thing any driver can do for engine longevity. And it has nothing to do with the type of oil you use or the brand of filter you buy. It's timing, specifically the timing of your oil changes. I cannot overstate how much this matters. Engine oil has one fundamental job. It keeps metal from touching metal inside your engine. When you run an engine, tiny microscopic particles of metal, combustion byproducts, acids, and moisture all find their way into the oil over time. The oil's additives and the filter work together to manage this, but they have limits. After a certain number of kilometers or a certain amount of time, whichever comes first, the oil's ability to protect your engine degrades significantly. And past that point, every kilometer you drive is doing measurable damage to your engine's internal components. Now here's where people make a costly mistake. They'll go out and buy a premium synthetic oil, expensive stuff, the best on the shelf, and then run it for 15,000, 20,000, sometimes even 25,000 kilometers because they read somewhere that synthetics last longer. Or they'll push past the service interval because life got busy, because they forgot, because they figured another month won't hurt. and the oil itself might still look relatively clean on the dipstick. But looks are deceiving. The additive package that makes the oil do its job is depleted long before the oil turns black. An oil that's been in the engine for 25,000 kilometers has been through hundreds of heat cycles, has absorbed combustion gases, has picked up fuel dilution, and has had its anti-wear additives significantly exhausted, regardless of how premium the base oil was when you poured it in. Fleet operators who manage large numbers of vehicles, taxis, delivery vans, company cars, understand this better than almost anyone. Attachment to vehicles. They're in the business of keeping engines running as long as possible at the lowest cost per kilometer. And almost universally, professional fleet managers change oil more frequently than the manufacturer's maximum recommended interval, not less. They've learned through hard experience that the vehicles with the longest engine life aren't the ones running the most expensive oil on the longest drain intervals. They're the ones with consistent, timely service on slightly shorter intervals. There's a mechanic I know who's been working on Japanese domestic market imports for over 20 years. He tells a story he's seen repeat itself so many times it's almost predictable. A car comes in with engine problems, excessive oil consumption, bearing noise, premature wear, and when you dig into the service history, the pattern is always the same. The first few years of the car's life, service was done on time. Then at some point, maybe the owner got busy, maybe they moved and changed garages, maybe they went through a tight financial period, the intervals started stretching. 6 months became 9, 9 became 12, 12 became 18. And by the time the engine is complaining loudly enough for the owner to bring it in, the damage is already done. The bearings have worn. The rings have developed deposits. The valve train is making noises it never should. The tragedy, he says, is that fixing those problems costs 5 or 10 times what it would have cost to simply change the oil on time for the life of the car. A $500 engine service interval stretched to save a few $100s ends up leading to a $5,000 engine repair. That math never works out in the driver's favor, and yet it happens constantly, everywhere, because the consequences of skipping an oil change don't show up immediately. You drive away and the car feels fine. It's only later, sometimes much later, that the bill comes due. Let me shift now to something equally important, but almost never discussed in the context of engine longevity. How you actually drive the car in the first few minutes after starting it, regardless of whether it's a cold start or just a brief stop between errands. The way you treat the engine when oil pressure and temperature are still stabilizing has an outsized impact on long-term wear. Think about what's happening in there during those first few minutes. The oil has drained down from the top of the engine while the car was sitting. The oil pump needs a moment to push fresh oil back up through all the passages, into the valve train, across the cam lobes, down to the rod bearings. That process happens within seconds of starting. Modern oil pumps are very efficient, but the temperatures are still low and cold oil is thicker and flows more slowly than warm oil. If you nail the throttle in the first 30 seconds of driving, hard acceleration, high revs, heavy load, you are putting maximum stress on engine components that are still running with marginally reduced lubrication. The oil is there, but it's cold and thick, and it hasn't yet fully formed the protective film across every surface it needs to coat. This is when the most wear happens. The mechanics who've torn down high-mileage engines describe seeing the evidence of this, specific wear patterns on cam lobes, on bearing journals, on cylinder walls, that tell the story of an engine that was routinely pushed hard before it was ready. You can almost read a car's history in the metal. Compare that to a driver who spends the first 10 minutes of every drive treating the engine gently. Moderate throttle, smooth acceleration, keeping the revs below 3,000 or 4,000 until the temperature gauge starts moving. That driver's engine, over the course of 5 years and 100,000 kilometers, has experienced dramatically less total wear during those vulnerable, cold start minutes. It sounds like a small thing. Across the life of an engine, it is not a small thing at all. Now let's talk about something that reveals itself not in dramatic failures, but in the slow accumulation of small neglected issues. One of the most consistent habits among drivers who end up with high mileage engines in excellent condition is this. They pay attention to small things early. They don't wait for the warning light to scream at them. They notice the sound that wasn't there last week. They feel the vibration that's slightly different from normal. They check the oil level not once a year, but once a month. They look under the car occasionally. They keep an eye on fluid levels. And when something seems slightly off, they don't tell themselves it's probably nothing. They get it checked. This is actually one of the clearest patterns in the Japanese approach to car maintenance, particularly among older drivers who grew up when cars required more attention and owners were more engaged with how their vehicles functioned. Regular inspections, not just at the service garage, but personal habitual checks, create a relationship with the vehicle where small problems get caught early. A slight discoloration in the coolant gets noticed before it becomes an overheating event. A minor oil leak gets addressed before it becomes a low oil seizure risk. A brake that feels slightly softer than usual gets inspected before it becomes a failure on a downhill stretch. In Japan, the Shaken, The mandatory vehicle inspection system ensures that cars are professionally assessed at regular intervals throughout their life. But more than the formal system, there's a cultural tendency among many Japanese car owners to treat the vehicle as something worth maintaining carefully, not just something to run until it breaks. The car is expected to be clean, to be functional, and to be attended to proactively rather than reactively. That mindset is more powerful than any individual maintenance tip, because it drives all the other behaviors automatically. There's another mistake I see constantly that accelerates engine wear in ways most drivers genuinely don't realize: over-revving a cold engine. This is distinct from the warm-up discussion earlier. This is specifically about pushing the engine to high RPM before it's reached operating temperature. Some people do this intentionally, thinking they're clearing the engine out or burning off deposits. Some do it accidentally because their morning commute involves a quick merge onto a fast road or a hill that demands more throttle. Either way, revving a cold engine hard, above 4,000 or 5,000 RPM before the temperature gauge has reached normal, puts enormous stress on engine components that are still running outside their optimal operating parameters. The thermal expansion of engine components is not instantaneous. Pistons, cylinder walls, valve guides, cam lobes, these are all machined to extremely tight tolerances that are correct when everything is at operating temperature. When the engine is cold, those clearances are slightly different. High RPM under cold conditions means more friction, more heat generated locally in ways the cooling system isn't yet managing well, and more wear on surfaces that haven't fully settled into their running temperatures. Many engine rebuilders will tell you that they can often identify engines that were routinely revved hard when cold by specific wear patterns that are different from what you see in normal high mileage wear. The damage is distinctive and it's entirely preventable. Now, let's talk about something that sits at the intersection of maintenance timing and fluid quality: your coolant and transmission fluid. These get overlooked dramatically more than engine oil, despite being equally critical to the long-term health of the car. Coolant degrades over time. Its pH changes. The corrosion inhibitors that protect the aluminum in your engine, your radiator, your water pump, those deplete. Old acidic coolant begins attacking the very surfaces it's supposed to protect. And yet plenty of drivers have never changed their coolant. They top it off when it's low, but they've never done a proper flush and fill since they owned the car. Inside their cooling system, there's often a rusty, acidic mixture that's slowly eating away at gaskets, seals, and metal surfaces. Transmission fluid is similarly neglected. Automatic transmission fluid in particular degrades through use. The clutch packs shed material, the fluid darkens, its friction properties change, and a transmission running on old, depleted fluid will wear faster and fail earlier than one that's been serviced regularly. The drivers who end up with transmissions that go 300,000 or 400,000 kilometers without a rebuild are almost always the ones who've been changing the fluid on a reasonable schedule since the car was new. It's not complicated, it's just consistency. Here's something else worth addressing because it's counterintuitive. Expensive aftermarket products, performance oils, additives, engine treatments, fuel system cleaners, do not compensate for inconsistent basic maintenance. I've seen people pour $200 bottles of engine treatment into cars with sludged oil that hasn't been changed in 2 years, expecting it to reverse the damage. It doesn't work that way. The best oil in the world, changed at the right interval in an engine that's driven sensibly, will produce better results than any premium additive dropped into a neglected engine. The fundamentals matter more than the extras, always. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a surgeon and you have 2 patients. One patient eats reasonably well, sleeps enough, manages stress, and doesn't smoke. The other patient smokes heavily, eats poorly, sleeps 4 hours a night, but takes the most expensive vitamins available. Which patient is healthier? The expensive supplements don't overcome the neglected basics. Engines are the same. Consistent oil changes, proper warm-up behavior, smooth driving, timely coolant, and fluid service. These are the fundamentals. They outperform every miracle product on the shelf. I want to give you one more real-world insight that I think really drives this home. There are taxi fleets in Japan, particularly in cities like Tokyo and Osaka, where individual vehicles have accumulated 400, 500, even 600,000 kilometers on the original engine. These aren't special vehicles. They're standard production cars, often mid-sized sedans with conventional engines. They achieve these numbers not because they were built differently from the cars you can buy, but because they've been maintained by people who treat every service interval as non-negotiable, who change oil consistently and on schedule, who address small issues before they grow, and whose drivers are trained to operate the vehicles in ways that minimize unnecessary wear. The longevity is manufactured through process. It is not a gift from the factory. When you understand that, the whole perspective on car ownership shifts. Your engine's longevity is not a lottery ticket you already scratched and either won or lost when you bought the car.